You own things: a watch, a pair of headphones, the bed you slept in last night. You didn't think about any of them today. Owning things is so ordinary it barely registers as a thought. Now try something. Imagine you were the thing being owned. Imagine someone else decides when you wake up, when you eat, whether your children stay with you, whether you live or die. Not as a prisoner with a sentence, not as a hostage with a ransom, as property, like a watch, like a bed that happens to breathe. For roughly 10,000 years, that was the reality for millions of human beings on every inhabited continent, in civilizations that had nothing else in common. The Sumerians did it. The Romans did it. The Vikings did it. The Aztecs did it. Societies separated by oceans and millennia, with no contact with one another, independently arrived at the same conclusion: you can own a person. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This isn't only something you can read about. In at least one remarkable case, scientists didn't have to rely on old texts or broken pottery at all. They found the proof written directly into a population's living DNA. Somewhere in your own genome, there might be a signature nobody ever told you to look for. Not a disease, not a trait. A pattern left behind by something that happened to one of your ancestors, centuries or millennia ago, that they never chose and could never undo. So how did any of this actually happen? How did a species that spent roughly 300,000 years living in small, cooperative, mobile bands, where almost nobody owned much of anything, arrive again and again at the idea that owning another human being was acceptable? The answer isn't one event. It's a formula. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. For most of human history, slavery almost certainly didn't exist. Not because ancient people were morally superior, but because the conditions that make it possible hadn't shown up yet. Anthropologist Richard Lee, who spent years studying the Juhawasi San people of the Kalahari Desert, described a society built on what he called fierce egalitarianism. Nobody accumulated much more than anyone else because there was nowhere to store it and no way to carry it while following the seasons. And critically, if someone tried to dominate the group, people simply walked away. You cannot own a person who can vanish into the landscape overnight. That's the first piece of the formula. Mobility is the enemy of ownership. Slavery requires a way to stop the property from leaving, so mobility was the first problem slavery had to solve. Here's the second one. To own a person, you also need something worth owning them for. Something valuable enough that controlling someone else's labor is actually worth the trouble. That thing showed up around 10,000 years ago. Grain. When humans started farming wheat and barley, everything changed. Grain does something no wild food before it could do. It sits still. It doesn't run away. It doesn't rot in a week. You can pile it in one place. You can count it. You can lock it behind a wall. And once something can be locked behind a wall, someone can control who gets access to it. Yale researcher James Scott studied this directly, and he put it simply: whoever controls the food supply controls the people who need to eat. That's it. That's the second piece of the formula. Mobility stopped people from being trapped. Grain gave people a reason to trap them anyway, and a way to do it. Put those two pieces together, and something new becomes possible for the first time in human history. Owning another person stops being pointless and starts being profitable. But those two pieces still aren't enough on their own. There's a third piece, and it's not about food or freedom to leave. It's about something happening inside the brain. In 2006, two psychologists, Lasana Harris and Susan Fisk, ran a simple experiment. They put people in a brain scanner and showed them photos of different groups of people. When someone looked at most other humans, a specific part of the brain lit up. The part responsible for recognizing that another mind is behind another face. That someone is really there. But when people looked at groups they'd been taught to see as the lowest of the low, that part of the brain went quiet. Instead, the parts linked to disgust switched on. The same parts that react to spoiled food or garbage. Not a person anymore. Just a thing. That's the third piece. Dehumanization. Convincing yourself someone isn't fully human because of their language, their religion, where they're from, or the color of their skin. Put all three pieces together, and slavery appears. Every time. On every continent. In cultures that never even knew each other existed. Here's proof this really is a repeating formula, not just something one culture stumbled into. The oldest written record of slavery isn't a rumor or a guess. It's carved into clay. Ancient tablets from the Sumerian city of Uruk, over 5,000 years old, use a specific word for slave. And they describe people using the exact same grammar used for cattle and land. Same sentence structure. No difference at all. And this same formula shows up in places that had zero contact with each other. Along the Pacific coast of North America, the Haida and Tliget peoples never farmed a single crop. They didn't need to. The rivers were so full of salmon, you could practically walk across the water on their backs. That surplus alone was enough. With it came the same hierarchy, the same dehumanization, the same practice of owning other people. As late as 1886, a Haida man named Sakwa asked a court in Alaska to free him from the man who owned him. That's not ancient history. That's a single generation after slavery officially ended in America. And here's the part that should really make you stop and think. Nearby groups living in the exact same environment, with the exact same resources, looked at their slave-owning neighbors and chose not to do it. Not because they didn't know about it, because they saw it and decided against it. Which tells you something important. Slavery was never automatic. It was a choice, made again and again by some people, and refused just as deliberately by others standing right next to them. Now here's where this stops being a history lesson and becomes something personal. A scientist named Suna Ebenesersdottir studied the DNA of 25 of the earliest people to settle Iceland, and she found something strange. The male side of their family tree was almost entirely Norse. The female side was almost entirely Irish and Scottish, not an even mix, a lopsided one. And historians already know exactly what causes that pattern. Viking raiders captured women from Ireland and Scotland and brought them across the ocean as property, not as partners. That's not a guess or a story passed down. That's written directly into the bones and the DNA of the people who actually lived it. And Iceland is probably not unique. It's just one of the few places scientists have studied closely enough to see it clearly. The same pattern, forced movement, written into DNA, may be sitting quietly inside an enormous number of people alive right now. You are not defined by what happened to your ancestors, but in a very real, measurable way, you are partly made of it. Every time a scientist studies where someone's ancestors really came from, they're reading a kind of history book, except it isn't written in ink. It's written into inheritance itself. And that book tells the same story, over and over, in cultures that never even met each other. That people have spent an enormous part of history moving other people by force. And that the people descended from those who did the taking, and the people descended from those who were taken, are today, very often, exactly the same person. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Every week, there's another story like this one, about the ancient forces that quietly shaped who you are. If that's something you want more of, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. Somewhere in your genome, there might be a signature nobody ever told you to look for. Now you know the formula that put it there. And now you know it might already be telling your family's story. whether anyone ever wrote it down or not.